When we say narration with regard to cinema, we basically mean the process of telling a story. When we talk about connecting shots with each other, moving from one scene to another, in critical language, we often also call that narration, even though there may not be an actual story that you see, through the process. So the very exercise or the very practice of connecting images with each other, or sometimes images with sound, can be brought under the sort of label of narration in film studies. So as we study the beginnings of narration, the emergence of narration, we assume, and this is something that film historians have always assumed, that in the very first years when cinema came into being, and we have a more or less a date for that, 1895, we have sort of more or less accepted that as the year when film began, 1895. If you look at the first few years, one would find that there is no actual narration taking place, in the sense that the camera is just recording whatever is put before it. You could put a performance, you could put a sports event, you can put something that is not enacted, but something that is actually happening, which they used to call actualities. So the camera, just from one static point of view, one position, recording one complete action or one part of the action, cannot be brought under narration, in the sense that you are not joining anything to anything. You are not going from one shot to another. You are not going from one image to another. So the general sort of consensus is that initially, in the very first years, cinema did not narrate in that sense. Sometimes there would be a story that is enacted before the camera. Let's say, if I take a camera to a theater, and somebody puts up a performance of a story on the stage, and I record the whole thing with the camera from one static point of view, without cutting, without joining anything, without editing, it would be a story. It would certainly be a story, but one must remember that this won't be narration, in the sense that we are not, technically speaking, joining anything with anything else. So unless some kind of editing comes into play, the question of narration, technically, in the study of cinema, does not arise. So this initial period, when there was almost no narration, primarily, predominantly, cinema was pre-narrative, cinema was non-narrative in that sense, is the period that we now call the early cinema period. And in this episode, and in the following episode or the module, we shall be talking about this period, the early cinema period, the emergence, the first sort of elements of the first signs of the emergence of narrative cinema. So this early cinema that we now use to designate this period, let's say between 1895 and roughly 1906, sometimes 1907, there is, according to, if you follow historians of cinema, some would say one can extend that period up to 1908. Somebody would say no, 1906. It doesn't matter. Let's say the first 11 years, 12 years, first 10 years. When we call that period the early cinema period, we spell early cinema with capital E and capital C. When you read the text that we have for you, you will find that the authors are also using that the description early cinema with capital E and capital C, not with small e and small c, because this is now, when we say early cinema, it doesn't mean just early. It doesn't mean cinema from the early years or cinema from the old cinema. Old cinema. It doesn't mean that. It means specifically a particular kind of cinema that was produced almost all over the world between roughly 1895, when cinema came into being, and 1906 or 7, when editing, in that sense narration, is more or less kind of developed. At least one can sense that most filmmakers are using some kind of editing. That's happening around 1906-7. So 1895, what happened? Why do we put the date in 1895, the date of beginning of cinema? What happened was that the Lumiere brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumiere, two French brothers, businessmen, they screened a number of short films in Paris on the 28th of December. That's the very end of 1895. This was screened for an audience and a paying audience, some audience which paid for the show. So all the conditions of cinema, more or less, were met. You had moving images on the screen. You had an audience, a group of people watching it on the screen. So there is a projection for people, and not for a lone viewer. So that had happened earlier, by 1892, that people could look through a hole and see the moving image. But that's not cinema. You have to have an audience. You have to have a group of people. So that happened on 28th December 1895 through the efforts of the Lumiere brothers. And 1905, the first cinema hall came into existence in the US, called Nickelodeon, because they wanted to pay a nickel to get into the theater. And then by 1995, 6, 7, we see filmmakers are slowly moving from one reel films to multiple reels. So let's say 2 reel, 3, sometimes more than that, 4 reels. And they're using that, they're cutting the scenes, they're joining them, they're using some kind of editing, so they're practicing narrative cinema. We should tell you about the features, the distinguishing features of the early cinema period. And the texts, the essays that you will read will also tell you about the same thing. And we shall show you some sequences, some scenes from the early cinema period, made by various filmmakers, which will give you a kind of an illustration of exactly what these distinguishing marks of early cinema are. One thing that everybody noticed from early on is that it looked like theater. It looked like things are happening on stage. This is not something that we expect from cinema today. We expect from cinema to be more happening in rooms, sets, streets, landscapes, and so on. And people are behaving as if they are also on stage. So that you have a static frame, the frame doesn't move. Now, of course, if you look at cinema, the frame moves all the time almost. It's exactly the opposite. Most of the standard films from, let's say, India or elsewhere that we see, the commercial films, you'll see that it's constantly moving. It's going everywhere. But early cinema, static, one position, one shot, one film. It's over. And that made people in front of the camera, the people you watch, also look like they were almost on stage, even if they are not on stage, really. Sometimes they were on stage, but sometimes they were not, right? Like in actualities. Actualities are almost like documentaries. You're just shooting things that are happening in front of you. But the way they are organized, composed, the frame is composed, you can see that they are kind of trying to put everything in the foreground, so that if the frame is like that, you wouldn't put characters in the background or midground, but push them to the foreground. They would all be arranged laterally, so right to left, left to right. Whenever they did something that they wanted to be visible, because there is no editing, so they would often tend to turn towards the camera and speak with each other. There's no sound, it's silent cinema. Sound comes much later, but nevertheless they move their lips. This is often called the tendency of frontality, as if everything should be pushed up front. Everything should be pushed towards the front, as if people are putting everything on display. This is one thing, frontality. The other thing is, because there's no cutting, there's no editing, there's no change of angle. The camera is not changing from one angle to another. Right? If you want to do that, you have to edit. The camera is taking the position of let's say, a viewer in a theater. If you go to see a play being enacted on stage, just think of yourself as sitting in the auditorium. And think of the early cinema camera as exactly fixed in your position, right? Looking at the stage. Now the theater viewer does not get up from the seat and try to get closer to the stage, does not look at it from this angle, that angle. It doesn't happen. It's actually fixed. So since there is no such thing, the tendency is to place the action in such a way so that through frontality and other means, and as I said, right to left, left to right, lateral kind of composition, in such a way that the whole thing looks like, the tableau that you see sometimes on the Republic Day processions. So if you transpose that to cinema, early cinema looked like it was composed of one tableau after another. So even when the initially the editing process came in, even when the filmmakers started joining one scene with another, it wouldn't be the real editing, because what they would do is they would finish the whole action in one shot, stop there, and they would start the following action in another place, finish that. They would go to the third place, start another action, finish it. This is not the kind of editing that we see now in cinema. What we see is a single action being broken up into many perspectives, many little bits and pieces, so that you don't see the whole action. You see bits of it joined together in such a way that it looks like a whole. You get the sense from our contemporary cinema that it's all one thing, but it is not.